You did all this, so now you have to take notes. Just get ready. There you go.
Okay. Back to see. You want to find out about a book club?
Another minute for stragglers.
No wondering. Yeah. Download your stuff. It's gonna be in downloads.
All right.
Okay. I'm gonna save it to this folder. And I also created in this folder. Actually.
All of it.
This is not YC.edu, and I'm not sure what YC.edu is.
What I'm saying, the way she showed it, it should all be right down. the
Okay,
line.
I didn't take attendance last time, so we'll find out today who's here and who everyone is. I'm also gonna be building my seating chart as I call the names, so if there's a little bit of delay in between names, that's what I'm doing. Adrian Kahn. Not sure I got that. Okay. Christopher Collin. Daniel Lanier. Davis Hanlon. You got my new email from Medicaid, right? Well, that's a tough one. Ikaika?
Ikaika.
Huh?
Ikaika.
Ikaika, okay. Neil, is that how you pronounce the last name?
Nihi. Eyes are
Oh,
easy.
there's another I, okay, Neil. Okay. All right, you might have to correct me on that a few times.
No worries.
See, I just showed you working.
Okay, James Dunk. Jason Rice, Reese Rice. Jason. Jonah Denlinger. Joshua Jackson. Cameron Edwards. Logan Marriott. Marjorie. Sean Lepin. Is it Lepin like the
John Lappin.
bunny rabbit in French, or is it Lapin?
Lappin. Yeah. 2 P's instead of 1.
And Sean Sutton. Skeeter Skeeter. How do you pronounce it? Skylar. The big one. Slade Nixick. And Kevin Parks. Okay, 2 people came in late. I thought Adrian, or maybe I already caught him. Aiden Khan. Okay, that's you. Okay. 3. 6. Okay, so module 2 is about basic switch configuration. Mostly it's end device, but hopefully you know how to configure a PC with its IP address by now. So during the PowerPoint, I want to, I need to do roll on the Zoom land out there, so hold on a sec.
CNT140.
Okay. Out in Zoom, Andrew Clem, are you out there? Let's see you. Oh, I do see you. Okay. Can you hear me all right? Okay. And Devin Ray. Actually, I can see all your names on the thing, so I'll just do it that way.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, thanks, Devin. I can see everybody's name in Zoom, so I'll just do it that way instead of taking the time. Call your name. Unless Zoom is reporting something different than who you are. Richardson. Johnny Endress, that's Johnny Endress.
That is correct.
Devin. Anthony Cluck. Curtis.
I'm here.
All right, thank you. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So I've got all 7 of you. Actually, before I start, well, actually, I'll continue my thought from before. Since we're going to be going over basic switch configuration, I want you to have Packet Tracer up on your whatever computer you're using, your laptop or the desktop machine. Anybody need the login for the computer here? So the username CCNA112 and the password is segment all lowercase for the classroom machines. So yeah, so have Packet Tracer up and running and ready to go. We'll be getting there in, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. Where we're going to just do a couple of in-class little labs to follow along with the chapter. Let's see what else. Everyone have, well, if you don't have Packet Tracer on your laptop and that's what you're using, then either install it now or open the desk and use one of the desktop machines. Because one of the things that I find with doing device configuration like this, and this goes for any sort of command line interface, is you have to just do it a lot of times. Reading what the command is, you'll never, unless you've got an eidetic memory, it won't sink in what command does what if you just read about it. You have to do it. And if you do it a lot of times, you won't even have to think about it. And for these, the stuff that we're going to learn in this class, it's all the real basic stuff. And so when we get to CNT150, where we get into more advanced commands, longer commands, a bunch more commands than you'll see in this class, you don't want to have to try to think about all this basic stuff. You're still going to have to do it. You're still going to have to configure the VTYs, the virtual terminal, and the console password, and do all the initial setup of the router or the switch in CNT150, but you want to focus on the new stuff. And so if you do all the labs in here enough times, and I mean just sometimes do them, of course, the labs are sort of structured so that the beginning commands you do every lab anyway. You enter the user, well, actually, you're on a white router. So you basically get into config mode or privilege mode first, then config mode, and you create an enable password or privileged mode password. You create console password, you create virtual terminal passwords. Those things you do over and over again anyway, but that's a good thing. You want your fingers basically to know what to do without you having to think about it so that you can focus on the new stuff once we get to the new stuff. I mean, that's pretty much it. Sometimes I can't even remember how to tell someone to do something on a router or a switch. But if I sit at the router or switch, my fingers know what to do. I mean, it's just, and that's true for a lot of people. It's just the context of where you are with the keyboard at the terminal. Your memory works a lot better if you've been doing those same commands dozens, really hundreds of times. So I just really recommend that even these simple labs that we'll be doing in here, relatively simple, do them multiple times. Because especially when we get to the skills tests, you don't want to have to think hard about how to get into configuration mode or how to configure an IP address on a router or switch, a router interface or an SVI on a switch. You want just to know how to do those so you can focus on the problem, which is usually going to be some sort of subnetting thing and maybe configuring routing and, you know, working on the problem rather than having to fight with the commands. And so the more you do them, the more you'll be able to do that. Okay. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about the CNT140 class, the third class in the CCNA program. And who brought that to my attention? Thank you. You know, and I said that if the course is not in your declared major, financial aid won't pay for it. That's still true. But if you are a full-time student and you're taking a full load of classes, anything above a full load is free. That's called the full-time student discount. So that means if you're taking, what is it, 12 or 15?
12.
So if you're taking 12 credits in the spring, and that's being paid for, let's say, by financial aid for those that are, you know, being paid for by financial aid, or whoever, however you're getting it paid for, doesn't matter whether out of pocket or through financial aid or whatever, you can take that additional class CNT140 and it won't cost you anything. So just keep that in mind. I know it's an extra class, it's extra work and everything, but like I said, in the long run, it might be worth it, worth the time and the money. Okay, so I'm going to start this PowerPoint. Does anyone have any questions before I get started on anything that you were doing over the weekend for the class? Anything like that? Yeah.
For the NetAcad exams, are they unlocked yet? Or?
Yeah, they're the NetAcad exams. The first one is exam 1 through 3. That is, I have not enabled it yet. So if you're looking to work ahead, you can't work quite that far ahead, but I will be enabling them this week.
All right.
Probably maybe after class. Yeah, apologize if you were trying to get really ahead of things, if you weren't able to. Any other questions or issues? Okay. All right, then I'll start this. And I need to share my screen. All right, Zoom land, I'm sharing my screen so that you can see what's going on here. All right, so there we go. All right, so these are the things that we're going to talk about. Cisco iOS. They had the name before Apple did. So Cisco has been named their operating system that runs on the routers and switches iOS since I've been in routing and switching, which was the, when was that? Late 90s, 98, 98, something like that. So they've had that, name for quite a long time. So we're going to basically talk about how to access get into the iOS and then navigate throughout the command structure within iOS. And that's really important. It's important that you understand how to move around inside the command line interface, because as I mentioned last time, there's not just two modes, there's three major modes: user mode, privileged exec mode, which we sometimes just call enable mode, and configuration mode, config mode. But then there's a whole bunch of sub-config modes, and you'll see that as we go along. All right, so we'll get into all those little details as we go along. If you haven't already, you might want to copy the packet tracer zip file that's in the Canvas downloads module in Canvas. If you're going to be using the machines in here, or if you want to copy it to your laptop, whatever, that way you just have all of the packet tracer exercises, the labs, easily available. It's not something you have to do, but it's up to you. All right, so the iOS it's an operating system. OS stands for. And it does everything that most operating systems do. It's got a shell, which is your mainline user interface, right? So this is how operating systems are typically drawn. The shell is on the outside because that's what the user has access to. And then there's a kernel, which is kind of the brains of the operating system, the heart of the operating system. And then the kernel sits on top of hardware. And that's pretty much every operating system out there is designed like this. In Windows, the shell is just a GUI. That's the big difference. Same thing with Mac OS. In Linux, the shell is a command line as well. And you can start a GUI, but the GUI is not the primary interface on a Linux machine. And there is no GUI on these Cisco routers and switches. There are routers and switches, and even these do have a basic HTTP web-based GUI that you can access, from another machine. But it doesn't let you configure stuff. It just lets you look at some status information. I pretty much never use it because it's not very useful, at least for my purposes. Some people that are hooked on GUIs, might get some use out of the HTTP interface, but we're not even going to mention it or talk about it outside of what I just said in this class. It's not part of what we learn in these routing and switching classes. So the shell is what you need to be concerned with. It's a command line user interface. You know what a GUI is. I'm not gonna. After this, I think I have to research why that's happening. My PowerPoint just keeps quitting and restarting. It actually quits and restarts. I think it might be related to static. So I'm not going to talk more about what a GUI is. You know what a GUI is. What the purpose of an operating system, or at least let's say the shell, whether it's GUI or command line, its purpose is just to take user input and process it and produce some sort of output. Whether the input is a mouse movement or a click or a keyboard input, it's just all input to the user interface. And depending on what's being clicked on or where the mouse is being moved or what information is being typed in, the user interface does something. Sometimes if it's a GUI, sometimes it just, redraws your pointer on a different place in the screen. Sometimes it highlights an icon, or if you double click it, it starts or opens a file that you just double clicked on. Okay, with CLI based operating systems, command line interface, that's what CLI means. You pretty much just have to learn the commands. So those who's used MS-DOS very much, or let's say the command prompt in Windows or DOS. Yeah. So, some of you, what about Linux? Who here's had Linux or used Linux? Several of you. Okay, so you know about command line interfaces if you've used Linux for sure, or the command prompts. It's the same thing. This is, a screenshot of a Linux machine, I think, and doing essentially a directory listing. And so that's what we've got with Cisco iOS. You enter a command and it does something. If that command is something it recognizes, it does something based on what you entered. All right, so how can you access the command? Well, let's say the shell prompt on a router or switch. Initially, with physical devices, not packet tracer necessarily. Packet tracer makes it a little bit easier than with physical devices. With physical devices, initially you have to access the console. The console is a serial communications port. You have a cable. One end plugs into what is called the COM port on your computer, or if you don't have a COM port, which most laptops don't today, even a lot of desktops don't come with COM ports anymore, then a USB to 9-pin or USB to serial of some sort. And then the other end looks like an RJ45, looks like a Ethernet plug. It is an Ethernet plug, but it's not used for Ethernet. The cable is not an Ethernet cable. That plugs into an RJ45 port on the router or switch, which is always labeled console. So on those racks, the routers have the console port sticking out towards you. The routers are the bottom two devices, and the console ports are facing you. The switches, which are the top two devices, the console port's in the back. And so you'll just have to kind of move it around and look for the console port when you're plugging it in. Unless you guys, do you have the console port wired or something else or not? No.
The one except for these routers, we're also on the back.
Oh.
These small routers on the back, but all of those are different.
Oh, okay. So some of the routers.
These cell routers.
Okay, yeah. So some of these routers do have the console on the other side. So you'll look for, typically on a Cisco device, the console port is labeled console and it's in blue. Whereas the other ports are labeled usually in yellow or some other color besides blue. And so they kind of, stuck with the blue theme with their cabling too. Not always. Sometimes you get black cables when you buy a router or switch, but it used to come always in blue. All right, so the console is the only way that you can configure the device when it's straight out of the box. It has no configuration whatsoever. It doesn't know how to communicate with anything except out that console port until you configure it otherwise. So that's different than your typical, home routers, like a Wi-Fi router. Wi-Fi routers come with some pre-configuration. They've got a LAN port that's configured with an IP address, usually 192.168.1.1 or something similar. And the other, let's say with the internet port that's configured to get its IP address via DHCP. Well, with Cisco devices, there's no configuration to begin with. And so you have to use the console port with a laptop or something like that to get access to it. All right, once you've got access to it, then you can configure these other modes of communicating with the router or switch remotely so that you can use the network to communicate, hook up to the router or switch through Telnet, or better through Secure Shell, which is, really, they're both just protocols that provide a terminal-like interface from the device to the computer that you're using. All right, but both of those, neither of those are configured, since there's no IP addresses configured or anything from the get-go. So you have to get the device up and running to begin with. Okay, so on a physical device or a physical router or switch, you're going to have to use a terminal emulator in order to get a serial communication window to the console port. And a couple of the different programs that we have loaded on these PCs over on the bench, one is called PuTTY, that lets you use Telnet, SSH, Serial, and a couple others. And the other one is TerraTerm, and there might even be a third version over there. But most likely, I think usually we use PuTTY for most of the labs. But you can try the other terminal emulators to see how they work as well. And when you bring up a terminal emulator to communicate to the console, you're going to have to select Serial. Okay, I think a lot of them come up nowadays assuming you're going to do a network connection, and they come up defaulted to SSH or Telnet or something, usually SSH today. But you'll have to change that to Serial if it's not already. And anyway, the first lab that you do the physical labs on kind of goes through the configuration that's required for PuTTY or TerraTerm or whatever. 9600 baud, no parity, no error correction. Basically a real basic serial connection. Okay. So let's do that. What we're going to do is we're going to simulate the idea of using a terminal emulator within Packet Tracer. Now I'll tell you now, and maybe some of you that have already, well, some of you I'm sure have already used it. You don't have to do this because you can double click on the device and get a terminal window. Or a console window, let's call it. But just so that you understand the idea better, we're going to right now create this configuration in Packet Tracer. We're going to drag a switch, drag a PC, and then the blue connection is a console port. So if you haven't already, go ahead and start Packet Tracer. I'll bring mine up. All right, so once and Packet Tracer asks for a login, it's your Cisco login, your Netacad login. So as long as you've already logged into Netacad, then just use that same login. If you don't or forgot your credentials or something, I think it usually lets you, after a little mucking about, you can get a, let's say, a guest connection to Packet Tracer. Okay, so what we want to do is drag a switch and a PC. So if you look down in our left-hand bottom left-hand where all the device, I call it the device palette. We've got, so the top line of devices is asking you to choose what type of device. And the bottom gives you a specific device within that type. So we want network devices and we don't want routers, we want a switch. So once we've got the switch selected, we can then go over here and grab a switch and throw it onto the pallet. I usually use PT switch, packet tracer switch, because it's real simple. It's just got a few ports and it boots up quickly. Some of the others take a while to boot up and we don't need to waste the time. If you chose a different one, it'll probably work too, except for PT empty. Empty means just that, there's no ports. There might be there probably is a console port on there, but there's no Ethernet ports, which isn't very useful. So I just drag PT switch up there. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Get rid of this stupid, oops. I'm just going to see if I can make things bigger. Is that?
If you go to more on the screen share bar, you should be able to hide it. Hide video now.
Yeah. That's all right. I thought I tried this last week and I couldn't figure out how to get rid of it. Hide floating meeting controls. Thank you. Okay. So I'm just going to set a few things. Bigger router. That. I guess they'll have to do. I can zoom, but if I start zooming, if I use the zoom, at least in the past, maybe they fixed it. It messes up like where I'm clicking, it doesn't. I don't know, maybe they didn't fix it. All right, so that way everyone can see hopefully a little bit better. And then so there's our switch, and then we click on end devices, and we see a palette of PCs and laptops. So we drag a PC up there, and then we want a connection. So we hit the lightning bolt icon, and the blue connection is our console cable. See, when you hover over a cable type, it shows you what type down below. So with the console cable, we click on the PC. Now, which one of those ports do I want to connect the console cable to?
The serial RS-232.
RS-232, right. That is another name for the COM port or serial port on a PC, an RS-232 port. That's just basically the physical protocol that's used. And then drag over to the PC or to the switch, and again, click on it, and it opens up a palette of where do we want to connect this? Well, it's a console port, console cable, so we want to connect to the console port. Okay, so now we're connected physically to the switch. Now what we want to do is pull up a terminal emulator. So we just click on the PC, and you'll see some tabs up here. We want the desktop tab and terminal. And so this is a real simplified terminal emulator user interface, but this is basically the settings that you would want on an actual terminal emulator on your PC on the physical devices. 9600 bits per second, 8 data bits, no parity, one stop bit, no flow control. And that's kind of like a standard. A lot of them come, a lot of serial connections on terminal emulators will come up with that configuration by default. But if it's not, if it's a different baud, or bits per second, a different bits per second, or if the parity bits are set or whatever, then you might have to change it. But this will be the configuration that works. So we say okay, and we get a terminal. So when the switch boots, it spews out a bunch of information, just like a computer does with its splash screens of its power on self-test, because this is just like a computer. I mean, this is a computer. It's just a very specialized computer for doing just switching. So it's got a power on self-test just like a PC does, or a Mac or whatever. And that's what you see. And at the end, it kind of tells you what version of the operating system is running and some other stuff, right? So rather old, 2006, version 12 is a pretty old version, but it's a well-loved version. It works and does the basic stuff. All right, so this is our prompt, our switch prompt. If this was a router, it would say router instead of switch. And you will see the greater than sign. All right, so it's important what that last character is, because that is basically telling you what the mode is that you are in. And the greater than sign says you are in user mode. Yeah.
Oh, all right. This exec mode.
User exec mode. Yes. It's called user exec mode. That's its full name. I just call it user mode. All right, so let me see. I don't want to get too far ahead of PowerPoint. All right, so there's your user exec mode, privileged exec mode. And greater than sign, pound sign to differentiate the two. And so to get from one mode to the other, to get, who knows, to get from user exec mode to privileged exec mode, what command can we enter? Enable. Enable. We're basically saying enable privileged exec mode. User exec mode doesn't let you do much. It lets you see some stuff, not all. Doesn't let you see the running configuration of the device. Lets you see things like the routing table and basic stuff that let's say a junior technician might be asked, go in and take a look at the routing table on such and such router and tell me if there's any routes that are down, or tell me, if this particular route is up or not. But it doesn't allow you to do any configurations. You can't restart the router or switch or anything like that from user exec mode. Privileged exec mode, you can pretty much, well, by default, the default privileged exec mode, you can do everything. You're now root, let's say, if this was a Linux machine, or your administrator, if this was a Windows machine. You can now restart the router, you can wipe out the configuration, you can even wipe out the flash memory if you really wanted to, and break your switch or router. Sometimes you have to wipe out the flash, like if you're going to be upgrading to a new version of iOS and you don't have room for multiple operating systems in the flash memory, then you have to delete what's on there so you can download a new version. All right, so we're in user or privileged exec mode, so known by the pound sign. And then the next mode is config mode. So privileged exec lets you see everything that you want, as well as do some, real high level changes to the device, like restarting it or messing with the configuration files and the memory files like the flash. You can save the configuration, erase the configuration, things like that from privileged exec. But in order to actually configure the router, you need to be in configure mode. So here I'm going to start with showing you some of the command completion. As long as you enter enough characters at the command prompt, at the prompt, that iOS recognizes the command. In other words, there isn't, it's a valid first 4 letters in this case, and there's no other commands that start with those same first 4 letters, then you can just press tab and it will finish the command for you. And then another nice thing is it not only could finish the command, but it did a space. And now if I don't know what the options are after the configure command, I can press question mark. I don't have to press enter. I just press question mark. And it says, here's the options.
Yeah.
You can type terminal, or you can just type carriage return after typing configure. I'm not actually sure what happens if I just type carriage return, because I always do configure terminal, but we'll see. Okay, it prompts me. That's what it does. So whenever you see a prompt like this, and you see at the end, there's one of the options in brackets, that's the default option. So if I don't have to type any of these in, if I want terminal, I can just press enter and it will do configure terminal. So what that means, it doesn't mean I'm configuring the terminal. It means I'm configuring from the terminal. Okay, just like this, the other options were configure from memory, which basically would mean that it's going to pull in a file from memory. It's going to ask me what file and everything if I had chosen that option. Or configure from the network, which means it's going to prompt me for probably a TFTP IP address, an IP address of a TFTP server to upload a configuration file from the network, from TFTP server. I won't say never, I probably have a few times used these 2 options, because usually, when you're first configuring a device, you're configuring it from the terminal. You're going to go in there and start typing in commands. All right. All right. So we're in config mode now. Config mode will always have the device name and then config in parentheses, and maybe even a longer name like config-if or config-router or something else, depending on the sub mode you might be in. This is called global config mode, when it just says config, global config mode. And again, you got to kind of remember these mode names too, or at least remember what you can do in the modes. Like in global config mode, there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. Like I can't, just type in an IP address and configure an interface from global config. I have to get into interface config mode first. Global config mode usually is just the starting, it's the place where you do things like set some security options for the device and get into other modes. Okay, and then you see that the prompt says enter configuration commands, 1 per line, end with Control-Z. So Control-Z gets you out immediately. You have to hit enter to get back to your prompt. So Control-Z is kind of like a shortcut. Let me just show you. By the way, I'm just going to do Comp-T. Not only, you don't always have to have the full command. You don't need to do tab and get the word configure out. You can just use the part of the command that is necessary for Cisco to know, or iOS to know what the command is, and it takes it. All right, so I don't have to spell out configure, and I don't have to spell out terminal either, because the only 3 options are terminal, memory, and network, and terminal is the only one that starts with T. So Conf T is good enough for iOS to get me into configure terminal. All right, and then if I wanted to go and get into interface config mode, and I were to, well, let's say, so now I'm, in one level deep into config mode. I'm in a sub config mode. So here I could set an IP address and stuff like that. I'm not going to bother, but Control Z isn't the only way that you can get out of the terminal. You can also use end, but end only gets you one level back. So end will get me to from interface config mode to global config mode. I'm sorry. What was I looking for? Exit, I think. End actually does end. Exit was what I was looking for. Exit gets me one level back, and I would have to type exit again or end to get all the way out. So if you prefer using keystrokes, control keys instead of typing in commands for things when you can do it. It doesn't matter how many levels into config mode you might be at. There's some commands where there's probably, it goes 2 or 3 levels deep. Control Z will always get you right out, and so will end. Either way, you get all the way out back into privileged exec mode. Okay, so I didn't configure anything, but that's the basic, getting around within the modes of config and privileged exec. Now, there's not a lot of reason to do this, but if you did want to go from privileged exec mode to user exec mode, I don't ever do it. Disable will do it. So the reason you might want to do that is maybe you don't want to get all the way out of your console connection, but you also don't want to leave it in, super user mode. So you have to walk away from your desk or your workspace, wherever you are, and you don't want to leave it in privileged exec mode. So you type disable just so that it's in user mode in case somebody comes behind you and, accidentally or on purpose wants to screw something up. So in user exec mode, there's not much they can do. Now, again, you're going to be like, well, we didn't even have to enter a password or anything. Of course, that comes later. Initially, there's no security on these devices, none at all.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If we're in switch config mode and we wanted to enter the terminal command, we would have to put terminal and then something else.
Say this again, if you're in which mode?
So if I'm in the switch config mode.
Oh, the config mode, okay.
And I want to go into the interface, I can't just type interface, I have to do interface and then.
Yeah, to get in, you have to specify a particular interface. If you want to go into interface mode to like set an IP address or something on an interface, you have to specify the interface. You can't just say interface by itself. You have to say interface and then the name of the interface. Okay, so what was the command to get back into privileged exec again? Enable. And again, EN works.
Huh.
And I think maybe even, CON isn't enough letters. If you hit tab and it just repeats your command, that means you haven't typed enough letters for it to know what you want. But what you can do to find out, well, what commands do start with CON, type a question mark right after the last letter, no space. Okay, if you put a space and then question mark, it'll give you an error. And I'll actually try to look, it might even try to look up the name con. Anyway, if you want to find out what commands start with a certain sequence of letters, just type those letters, question mark, and then press, as soon as you press the question mark, it'll give you the list of commands that start with CON in this case.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think I broke my switch. I
How did you do that?
I did Command Z, and it wiped everything, and now it's just not responding at all.
Command Z. Okay, you're on a Mac, huh?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know
Or
the.
Control Z.
I don't know what the option for Control Z is on a Mac.
There is a control button.
Oh, there is. Oh, okay. So yeah. So you want to do Control Z, not Command Z, apparently, and I have no idea. Since I can't really see what you're seeing, are you saying your switch just went away?
No, like the terminal's blank, and I can't get. Like I typed enable, and there's no output.
Oh, okay. I'm not really sure. I would just maybe close out the terminal and then try it again. And if that doesn't work, then close out Packet Tracer and reopen it.
Okay, but the first thing you do is type enable, right?
Yeah, to get into privileged exec mode, yes, you type enable.
Right.
Enable
That's-
goes you from the greater than sign prompt, which is user exec mode, into privileged exec mode. You'll see the pound sign prompt.
Okay. Thank you. I will check in a minute, maybe.
All right. Sorry, I just don't use Macs very often, so I can't tell you how to get out of whatever it is that you're in. Okay, what else about this? All right, so use that question mark a lot. If I want to, show is a common command. Show does just what it sounds like. It'll show you some information about the device. And if you want to know what you can show about, just do show space question mark. And it gives you all the options, right? Tons of them in this case. The most common ones that you're going to do are going to be like show running config. Running config, which we'll get to that, but the running config is the name of the configuration in memory. It's basically a file in memory that the switch or whatever device, router switch, whatever, is using to do, it's basically how it's configured. It's what's in memory. And so if I do show running config, even though we didn't really do anything, there's a whole bunch of defaults set on the configuration. So, most of these we don't care about. This one, we will be changing this no service password encryption default to something else. Service password encryption later on. We'll be using the hostname command and changing it from just generic switch to some name to give the switch a name like switch 1 or switch A or whatever. Later on, we'll get, more interesting switch names. And then all this stuff is, spanning tree. We don't need to talk about that just yet. And then the rest of it is all the interfaces. So there's no specific configuration on any of the switch interfaces. Usually you don't have to do much, at least not right away. Later on, maybe towards the end of this class or certainly in the next class, we'll be configuring the switch interfaces for security and some other, some spanning tree stuff, some other stuff. All right, we'll talk more about interface VLAN 1 later because we will be configuring that pretty soon. And then the lines. The lines are also something that we'll be configuring pretty quickly in the class because those help secure the device. So line con 0, that is the name given to the console. So whenever you go into config mode and say line con 0, then you're configuring the console that you're connected to the device with. Usually the configuration consists of just setting a password. It's really, in this class, that's all we're going to do is set a password for the line. And then the VTYs are just like terminals, except they're remote, they're telnet or SSH terminals. VTY means virtual terminal. Although the Y doesn't really fit with that description, but it's virtual teletype, if you really want to know. That goes way back into computing, back into the 70s and 80s. But some of this terminology, you know, has survived. So anyway, the lines are what you need to configure to so that you can remotely access your device, your Cisco router or switch, so that you don't have to always be physically hooked up to it. You can be sitting in your office in a different room, building, state, country, and telnet into it or SSH into it if your device is so configured to allow that, and configure it from afar if those are configured properly. All right, and we'll get more, you know, we'll talk more about those as we get to them. All right, so we got global config mode, line config mode. I didn't show that, but that's if you're going in to configure the console or the VTYs, you get the config line prompt. And config IF, I did show you, is the mode for configuring a network interface, like a Ethernet interface, or in the case of the switch, a virtual switch virtual interface, which we'll talk about more later. Okay, so right, so that's just showing, you know, the process of going from user mode to privileged exec. They skip the command to get into config mode, but it's config your terminal, config T. Exit gets you back out. Once you're in config mode, you just type, you know, what is it that you want to configure? A line, interface, routing, if it was a router, other stuff on switches that you can configure. And so if you want to see, you know, just kind of a quick look at what can I configure on a switch, just do question mark. Once you're in config mode, you can just do question mark to get all the commands that are available in global config mode. So all the things that you can configure in global config mode are access list, the banner, which you will be configuring. You'll actually doing the message of the day banner. We won't be doing boot commands, but CDP, yeah, maybe in the third course, probably the third course. You can configure clock information, set certain commands to defaults. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Configure the enable password by using the enable is one of the few commands that is available in multiple modes. Enable gets you from user mode to privileged mode, but it also is a configuration mode so that you can configure the enable password so that you can't just get in there, you know, into God mode from user mode with no password. And so forth, the host name interfaces, some IP settings, all kinds of stuff that you can configure. And we'll probably, if you were to do all three classes, we'll probably end up using about half of these commands, maybe a little more than half. I don't know, half to 3/5 or something of the commands. In this class, probably there's just 5 or 6 in global config mode that we'll be using. Okay, so the interfaces have really long names, as you can see. And it's nice, you can shorten that. Again, just like everything else, the names of the interfaces can be shortened. So well, first off, what we're seeing in the PowerPoint may not reflect the names that are actually available on this switch. That's one thing that Cisco is not consistent with. And part of it is because different hardware kind of requires different naming conventions. But even when the hardware is more or less the same, the naming conventions for their interfaces is not all that consistent. So the best thing to do if you want to find out what your options are is just do int space question mark or interface space question mark, and it will list all the names of the interfaces for this device. So if I want to configure a fast Ethernet, I can type FA and then tab if I want, or once I get the hang of it, I can just do FA and then space question. And then it's gonna tell me what are my options after FA, because I can't just say interface fast Ethernet because there's a bunch of them. There's I think this one has 6 interfaces, 6 fast Ethernet interfaces. So they're numbered in some way. And it's usually at least a 2-part number. It's like module / interface number, or sometimes slot / module / interface number, or something like that. And again, it's not all that consistent. You have to find out how your particular device is naming things. Now they're consistent within the same models of device, but different models of devices might have different ways that they name the interfaces. Okay, so 0 through 9. So if I say 0/1, let's see if that works. All right, so 0/1 is a valid interface. And I get into interface config mode. All right, and then we can see what we can do in interface config mode. And we can all kinds of stuff, give it a description, set some let's say linking or interface channel groups, which are binding multiple interfaces together to form one faster interface, things like that. Duplex operation, the speed, if you don't like 100 megabits and you'd rather run at 10 megabits, you can make it run slower if you really want. So I can say speed, and those are my options, 10, 100, or auto. Most likely you want to leave everything alone as far as speed goes. By default, it's set to auto. And that means that whatever you plug into that switch, it's going to try to negotiate with the device that you're plugging into it to get the fastest speed and the best duplex mode, which will usually be full duplex. So usually you don't want to mess with this. The only time you want to mess with the speed or the duplex is if you're not hooking up, like you've plugged your device in and you're not getting a link, or the link is like blinking, which means it's trying, but it's not working. That rarely happens anymore. Used to happen, wouldn't say frequently, but once in a while, 20 years ago, when the network interface cards on PCs may have been cheap, coming from someplace that didn't adhere to the standard of auto negotiation well enough for Cisco to know what the heck they are able to do. So in a case like that, you would maybe have to force your device to a certain speed or duplex mode. But today it's a pretty rare circumstance. you can't go faster than the capability of the hardware, of course. That's why I can't take 100 megabit port and make it 1,000, make it a gig port. And only go slower. Let's see. Shit. All right, so we did most of this. Hopefully you did most of these commands as I was doing them. Enable, disable, config terminal, exit, end, control Z, and some of the subcommands. All right, now might be a good time for a break. So it's, let's go till 10 till by that clock. It's now 23 minutes till. So about 13 minutes, we'll resume with 2.3.
Yeah. Heard all of it. I put it in the classroom. Didn't want to.
I wonder if there's a
What
way
did
to
it say?
actually make the print on this
They
bigger.
may- Maybe they can do that. Yeah, I see, so.
I'll try to see it.
So I called and the counselor guy called me back and did something like that. So I said, over, I mean, you're gonna over, I guess. Bob, whatever. his name is. Yeah. That's how it is. There you go. But I'm like, hell, if I could get it done.
Yeah, that's big. You need to turn things on and off and get it in the right.
Everything but the terminal bigger.
All of these should be good to go. I had no reset. No router. No, 2 routers.
So everything should be,
All of them switches.
so you've got issues with some of that.
2 routers.
Oh, you gotta do that.
Figure it out. I think so.
You've done that before then?
It'll be 2 different. Look it up.
It'd be good option.
But it's worthwhile because I need to write down and get that, I want to get a feel of how to do that. But it's just 2 different.
Oh, and it's just the CLI. Oh, and then that, okay.
Mhm.
Because that changes the font for the CLI. That makes sense.
Whatever those are.
So stick
12 and it looks pretty good.
12,
Second
back
slot.
terminal.
So this one here.
Oh, yeah, that's much better. Okay. Actually see what I'm
So
typing
it's
now.
this router.
That router.
That's good.
What's the purple? Post on this?
That is the current operating system. It's kind of irrelevant, but I was making note of which one. Went through and updated the OS on all of them. Version. Me and Jen was sort of posted on it as to what version they were running, so we knew which one we updated. So it's technically not necessary.
You might wanna actually have that on there, though, with a permanent type of sticker.
We can do that.
Not, one that just, that you could peel off maybe later, but a label, so that, a year from now.
Well, so.
Right, you're
the
not gonna
plan was
remember.
I had a spreadsheet I was putting in as, that was, we were also gonna correlate them. Brendan was gonna tell me what label he wanted to generate. And we were gonna relabel them. And then have that label designated in a format as to what the router model was, what the iOS was, what, was it
Mhm.
running, et cetera.
Yeah, and it would be good to actually have the label, whenever
Inventory
possible,
style.
somewhere where you don't. Have to, take care of it hard to see. So you don't really want them on top. You can avoid it. There might be, this one's gonna be, well, yeah, you could probably. As long as it could.
I mean, if they're going to be mounted.
You could put it on the
bracket.
mounted, yeah, you could put it on the mounted bracket. My glasses, I can't see school. Okay, so the password does not show you any characters. Well, I think you are, it's just that you don't see anything. Do you know what you said the password is? Type that in. So it is taking, it just doesn't show you, doesn't show anything on the screen, not even stars or anything else. And the reason for that, another security thing is, once somebody knows, if somebody's shoulder surfing, they see how many characters the password is, like the number of asterisks or whatever. That's some information they have to be able to press pass. So it doesn't do any type of echoing.
Unless you need something from me, I'm just gonna take off.
Was that?
Unless you need something else from me.
No, go ahead. Did you didn't have any hours?
Oh. Today was? Oh, I'll submit it today.
Supposed to be by noon on.
Oh, you're right. I was in the hospital last 2 days. So I
Oh,
just
really?
completely forgot about it, yeah.
Well, how many hours do you think you had over the last? 'Cause you didn't fall, reconnect, or-
Yeah, we didn't have it for the first 2 days, but I was here
But you were
longer
here
on
this previous
Saturday.
week.
So I mean, it was probably 15 or something, I don't know, I think I figured.
Well,
I completely forgot.
I
about it. That was
mean-
my fault.
yeah,
It was one reliable week and then the second half of the other week.
I'm trying to decide whether we just add it on to future timesheet or whether you, because they're gonna make you do a manual timesheet.
Hmm.
So if you want to do that.
I have a copy of one already.
Okay, well, if you send it in, copy me on it because they'll ask me to approve it.
I don't even know what the sentence is, so I will definitely just email you and then, I
So
don't know if
they
it's the
keep,
same lady.
they,
I can look up in my email.
yeah,
history.
look who it is, because I don't remember either. It used to be Leanne, but I think she's gone. I think she retired or something. So I don't know who it is.
It's in my email history. Okay, yeah, sorry, I totally forgot about that. You're right. Okay. One last thing, we set that phone up. Interestingly, we plugged that PoE into that pocket switch. It completely reset the VLAN that's associated with 211. So Brendan had to go into the 212 router or switch rather and figure it out. I like re-put it on VLAN 1. And then all the computers in there were,
Oh my God.
which is weird to me because that seems like a security issue. If it read like
I mean, that's bizarre.
yeah,
So it doesn't like the PoEs? Or did it?
that was
Is it using it?
presumptive.
But are you still using the PoE thing?
Mhm.
Or you are?
We just
So it's
had, he
working.
had to go back in there and reconfigure
Do
where
all the route.
211
VLAN configuration.
for the VLAN. Because it pushed
Did
everything
you have a
attached to
copy of
that
the,
switch.
so it changed the whole running config?
I don't know if it changed the running config, but we would no longer access the internet and we were,
Yeah.
when you did like IP config or whatever, they didn't have an assigned IP.
I'm just wondering if you could have done reload. of the
Tried that.
You did?
I know, it's really bizarre. He understands it better than I do, so, but I'll have to ask when you're around.
Okay.
It's weird. But it works now.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
I asked in Canvas, I sent you a message about wanting a VLAB machine configured,
Why VLab what?
a virtual machine.
Okay, what about
Yeah.
it?
You asked us to message you if we
Yeah,
wanted one.
yeah. So we had a miscommunication. I had asked Brendan, actually, I think it's better here. I'd asked Brendan to make you a virtual machine. And I thought he had access to your Y number, which is what we use part of your Y number for the password. And it turns out he didn't. And I got that to him this afternoon. So you should have that virtual machine. You know what? I mean, if he hasn't gotten it done today, then I'll try to get it done before I leave tonight.
Oh, no worries. I was just making sure that you got the message.
I did, yes, I did.
Yeah, no worries. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, let's if we can. Continue on. Okay, is my screen still shared, you guys in Zoom? Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is just kind of showing some of the semantics of the commands in iOS. It's not so much different than any command line interface that you'll see. So you've got your prompt, which the prompt contains information aside from just being a prompt. It tells you the host name of the device, which always defaults to something simple like switch or router. And it tells you what mode you're in based on what comes after the host name. And then your command is the first thing, is what you type in first, followed by a space, and then followed by one or more keywords or arguments. So a keyword is another iOS word that is part of the command. Let's say it refines the command. So for example, Ping isn't a great example for that, but the interface command. Interface is the command, and then fast Ethernet 0/1 is a keyword that follows it. And then arguments are things like that can be different every time that you run the command. So an argument in the case of the ping command would be the IP address or a host name that you want to ping. Okay, so keywords are part of the operating system, or is a parameter that the operating system understands. An argument is something that it's basically like data that the command requires in order to do its thing. So like if you're in interface configuration mode and you want to set the IP address, you're going to type IP, which is the command, space, address, because there's other options that can follow IP, but address is one of them. So address would be the keyword, and then the address that you assign, the address that you type in, would be the argument. Again, it's just semantics. It doesn't matter that much to remember those details, but it helps when you're trying to read a manual, for example, or a user guide. Okay, so this is just telling us that, you know, in an iOS command manual, this is the syntax that will be used. Boldface is the command or keyword. Italics are arguments that you might supply. If you see something in square brackets, it means it's an optional keyword or argument. In curly braces, it is a required element of the command. And then you can have things like optional. So this last one where you've got something in brackets and curly braces, if you supply a keyword, you know, if you supply the X, then the Y or Z is optional. And this vertical bar means or. So in this particular example, even though it's not giving you too much information, it's just using X, Y, and Z. But if you give the X part of the command, then you can optionally do Y or Z, not both. Or you could use neither if you want. Okay. So an example, ping IP-address. IP-address is in italics. So that means that it is an argument that you're supplying. Same thing with traceroute. In this long command, which switch port security command, which you'll be doing probably in 150. Can't remember if they moved it to 160 or not. But anyway, you'll be setting switch port security on switch interfaces. So that's one of the longer commands if you spell it all out. And as you can see that if given all these keywords, then you have to put in either static or time or type or inactivity.
So
I'm understanding this correctly, we would be typing in switch port security aging and then picking one of
You would
those?
be typing in switch port, port security, aging, and then one of these options.
Okay.
Since they're in curly braces, it means you have to do one of these. So you're basically modifying the aging part of the command. Is the aging to be static, or is the aging to be a particular time? Or is the aging to be absolute or based on some sort of inactivity?
Gotcha.
Anyway, I wouldn't, don't worry about that command at all right now, because you won't need it for this class. It's just, that was a big, long example of a command with showing you the various options that you'll see. All right, we already kind of looked at the help features. There'll also, you're gonna make mistakes when you're configuring these devices, typos, and what have you. What is the mistake here?
Capital,
No, it is not case sensitive. Actually, I think everything is lowercase. It's not in config mode. Correct. It's in privileged exec mode. There's no config there in parentheses. So you can't go and type interface, go into to configure the interface when you're not in the config mode already. Okay. So when you see invalid input detected, and see, it's trying to tell you where. And apparently, privileged mode does have a command called interface, but not followed by the name of an interface. So it's telling you that's where the problem is. And it's not always right. It doesn't always, doesn't always point you to exactly where the problem is. Sometimes it's off a little bit, but it tries. All right, so, okay. All right, remember when I started to type in configure and I just did con? Well, if you just type some letters and those letters can be applied to multiple commands, then you'll get the error ambiguous. Ambiguous just means, yeah, con, I know what that is, but it can apply to configure or connect and, possibly others in some cases. So ambiguous simply means there's nothing wrong with the CON part of it, but you need more letters to make, so iOS knows which one of those two you actually want.
CONF enter and CONF tab is the same thing.
CONF enter will put you right into configure mode. CONF tab will just complete the command
And then if
for
we
you.
enter to
Then
go
you have to
into,
press enter. Yeah.
so it enters a shorter, faster way than tab.
Well, tab is just shows you the rest of the command.
Oh.
And it doesn't do a carriage return line. So when I do tab, it just completed the command for me. I didn't need to do that because EN is enough letters for iOS to understand that I mean enable. So I could have just said EN enter. But I'm gonna actually recommend that you at first type in the commands or at least do command completion like that. The reason is I remember taking one of my first CCNA tests and I saw a command on there. What the hell command is that? I didn't know what, I was like, I had to know what this command is. It was a command I'd been entering probably hundreds of times, but I never actually pressed tab to actually see the full command. Because I learned it, unfortunately, as the shortcut. And I don't know if I even knew back then that the tab would complete the command. I don't know. It was a long time ago. So I think it finally dawned on me what it was, but I had to sit there and look at it for a while and say, what is that command? Is just because I'd never seen the actual command fully typed out. I'd always use the shortcut. Okay. It was something else. Oh, the other thing about commands that are not understood by Cisco, if you just type in garbage that doesn't apply to a command at all, this is what you're going to get. And it's going to sit, and you're going to say, enter. What the heck? Control C. That doesn't work. And the actual way to get out of here is Control Shift 6. Yeah, we'll see that in the list of keyboard shortcuts. Control Shift 6 will, let's say, abort a command when it's in the middle of it. So what happened here is I typed in this ASD, which isn't a valid command, and I hit enter. And what iOS tried to do is it actually tried to connect my session to another device named ASD. That's what it does by default. I'm not a big fan of it, but basically, it tried to telnet to another computer or another router or switch or something named ASD. And so that's why it tried to look up the IP address, domain server, and it tried to send out a broadcast packet to see if there was a domain DNS server out there that could resolve ASD to an IP address. That's why it said name lookup aborted when I hit Control Shift 6. So when you typo a command in user exec or privileged exec mode, you're going to get that. There is a way to fix it. And there's a lab that will, I think there's a lab that tells you about this. In the past, I don't know, I can't even remember anymore. It was only last year that I taught it, but at least I think what it is they tell you what the command is to make this not happen in a packet tracer lab, but then they just expect you to know it in the physical labs. And people that didn't do the packet tracer labs first didn't know what the command was. So I'll tell you now, because it's going to be useful, even if you don't get to it for a while, because I don't remember exactly where they have you do this. You don't want this coming up every time you type on something. It's a pain in the butt. So in global config mode, you can do no IP. No IP domain lookup. No space IP space domain space lookup. 4 words. So IP domain lookup is the actual command that enabled this, and that's a default setting on the Cisco switch. So IP domain lookup tells the iOS to do this if it sees a name, something it doesn't recognize as a command. Putting no in front of any command will turn it off. So if you go into an interface and do IP address, blah, 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 and it's, you gave it the wrong address, you find, oh, shoot, that's the wrong address. Well, that address you won't overwrite the address by just typing IP address and a new address. Now that interface has 2 addresses. Okay, so if you ever do that, if you type in an address on an interface and it's the wrong address, don't just type in the right one and assume you're all good. Because if I actually see that happened, I'll take points off. So if you type in the wrong address the first time, then just say no IP address and then whatever address you wrongly typed in, and that erases it. And then you can type in the right one. Okay, so no IP domain lookup will prevent that nastiness from happening. So now if I type in the nonsense command, it says unknown command or computer name or unable to find computer address. In other words, it doesn't try to go look it up. All right. All right, so we've already looked at some of these hotkeys, shortcuts. Use when you want to use the up arrow and down arrow to recall previous commands. So if I use up arrow, it recalls commands I recently, since the last boot, or since the last, I don't know if it was last boot or the last time that I logged. I think it might be the last time I logged in that it saves. And it does this in all modes. So if I'm in config mode and okay, so now if I was like, okay, I have to do this for 3 different, in this case, VLANs, instead of typing in interface VLAN 2 and then repeating everything, I can just do up arrow. I got my interface VLAN back. I can just backspace over the 1 and say, I want to do the same thing for VLAN 2, and then set the IP address. Well, I probably set it at a different address, but you know, you get what I'm saying. I could then use, well, let me do that again. Could use the arrows to get to where I wanted to change, and then backspace over the 1 and put a 2 in there instead. So the arrows on the keyboard are non-destructive backspace, so that you can move to a different part of the line, and then backspace once you're in front of the place that you want to change. You use backspace to delete it and type in the new thing that you want. Okay, so now one of the commands that you'll use periodically is the show interfaces. Show interfaces lists the interfaces and gives you the status of them. And it's a bunch of printout, especially on switches that have a lot of interfaces, but I wanted to get to the VLAN one. So VLAN 1 has an IP address of this. Hope everyone remembers what /24 means. VLAN 2, okay. So in the case of a SVI, let me make sure. In the case of a VLAN, it didn't keep the first address that I put in there, but routers will. VLANs, I believe, VLANs can't have multiple addresses assigned to them, so it overwrote the first one when I put 1.1 in there. But router interfaces can't. So you need to undo if you put in the wrong interface. Yeah.
So for a router, you would do no, and
No.
then that, okay.
Yeah. If you just do no IP address, it wipes out, I think it wipes out all addresses. Okay, so you don't have to repeat the entire address over unless you've already typed in, you know, unless it's already got multiple addresses and you only want to get rid of one of them, then you have to say no IP address in the whole address. But if you want to just wipe out all addresses, you say no IP address. Okay, let's move on to some other stuff. So tab, backspace, seen what that does, the left arrows and right arrows. On certain types of devices, arrow keys won't work. I see that sometimes when I'm connected with a laptop with a USB the serial connection. I have to use Control B and Control F instead of left arrow and right arrow. And Control P is in place of up arrow if necessary. I think I don't know why they didn't do down. Yeah, down arrow will go, you know, if I just did up arrow a bunch of times, but I can do down arrow to cycle back through the command. So if I up arrow, oops, I went one too far, I can use down arrow to get back to it. I think it's Control D, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, so when you type a command that produces output, and there's more output than what the screen can hold, then you'll see the more prompt at the end. And if you want to page through or line by line through it, that's how you do it. The enter key will just go line by line. The space bar will get you the next page of output. So the most common place where you're going to see that is, or need that maybe, is in the show running config. So it shows me a screen full, and if I just want to go line by line, enter, or space to go page by page. And if you just want to quit, any other key will immediately quit the output. Control C returns when you're in configuration mode and ends and goes to privileged exec. Same thing as Control Z. And Control Shift 6 is the one I just showed you. If you have a DNS lookup or a trace route or a ping that just keeps going and going, and you want to break out of it, Control Shift 6. Okay. Because Control C won't break out of, like, you know, a trace route or a ping that just keeps going and going. Because you can do a ping and give it an option, but by default, ping will just send 4 pings and then report the results. But there's options to ping. There were extended ping that allows you to send, you know, as many as you want, basically forever, and use Control Shift 6 to exit out of that. So there's a packet tracer for you to do, navigating the iOS. So, and setting the clock. And we're going to go over basic device configuration now. So make sure, I think, you know, I'm sure I have that packet tracer assigned as something for you to do. It may not be one that you turn in, but it's definitely one that we want you to do. Pretty much all the packet tracers. There's a few that I may not have you do. I need to.
So there was you could have downloaded all the packet tracer files. Where would I find that on campus?
In under modules, all the way at the end under downloads. I think. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so like I said, switch is the default name of all the switches, and we can change that by using the hostname command, which I think is what Linux uses as well. Again, you got to be in configure mode, so I can just say hostname Prescott, and it changes the name in the prompt. Okay, so that's how you know that it took your command, and you know, if you're trying to remember, did I set the host name or not? Well, it'll be in the prompt if you did. Host names have to start with a letter, can't contain spaces, can end with a letter or a digit. Letters, digits, and dashes, no other special characters except dashes. 64 characters or less.
Is there real importance to setting the host name?
It doesn't have any real function. It might. Now, if you, in a big network, you probably want the host name to reflect the DNS name. And you can actually have the routers and switches go and register their name with a DNS server. So in that case, it might be, so that way you could just, from your office, telnet or SSH to the name of the device instead of remembering the IP address.
Gotcha, okay.
And so it's nice, even though you can have DNS set up with a totally different name, as long as the IP address is right, you know, SSH or telnet will work. But it's nice to have this match whatever DNS has in it. And it's, you know, again, when you're dealing with one switch, it doesn't matter. But in a big network with hundreds of switches, you want something descriptive so that, you know where you're at. Because sometimes when I've been on just even our small network, because we have probably a dozen switches, I'll be on one device and I'll hop to another one, you know, using telnet or SSH. And if I hop to like multiple, then I can lose track of where I am.
So this would be labeled like switch room 209, the other one would be like 208.
Yeah. If there was a switch in 208, I think there isn't. There's only switches in here and 212, and then across the hall is the main, you know, the main, what do they call it? I'm losing my mind with structured cabling. MDF or IDF, intermediate distribution facility. So across the hall is where all the other rooms go to. We're the only two classrooms that have a switch and a router in the classroom. And so, yeah, they have a name like building 19, blah, 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 blah. Okay. That's about it for host name, I think. Passwords, you know, use good passwords, except in this class. We don't want you to use good long passwords on your devices when you're configuring them, because what happens is you configure a device, finish the lab, walk away, the next person up, he doesn't know what you set for the privileged mode password or the user mode password for that matter, and they can't get in and we have to do password recovery, which two of the devices are in that state right now. You know, whoever configured them last configured them with a password that they shouldn't have. The lab tells them not to use, and we can't get into it either unless there's a password recovery process that you can do, which, you know, kind of, again, since this is, you know, part of a security degree or certificate, it tells you that if you have physical access to the device, there isn't any security, because it doesn't matter how strong your passwords are on those devices. If we have physical access, there's a key combination that you can enter while it's booting to put it into what's called ROM-on mode. And once you're in ROM-on mode, you can set up a particular register value so that the next time it boots, it doesn't load the configuration file. And the configuration file is where all the passwords are. So if it doesn't load the config file, it's basically just a blank device. And so, like I said, if you have physical access, there is no security. So what we're going to be using here is typically Cisco and class. Cisco will be your user mode and, well, let's say your console and VTY password, and class will be your privileged mode password, your enable password. Try not to vary from that. The labs will tell you to do this anyway. So don't get creative because you'll forget your creativity by the next class period and then, I mean, everyone should go through doing password retrieval, not retrieval, but, I guess it's sort of password retrieval. But basically getting into a device when you forgot the password. But we don't like to do it too many times if we can avoid it because it's kind of a pain. Okay, but everyone knows the rules about passwords. We're just not going to follow those rules in this class just for simplicity's sake. All right, so this is how you're going to set passwords, and I'll go ahead and do it now just so you see how it changes the access to the user interface. Line console 0, so this is going to set the console password. We're going to make it Cisco. For now, that's all we're not going to do the VTYs, at least not on this screen. And then we're going to configure the privilege mode password with enable. Now, there's two different enable commands. Enable password and then the password, and enable secret and then the password. We pretty much always want to use enable secret. The reason is enable secret will, the password will be encrypted in the file. So you won't actually see the password. You'll see a bunch of characters. If you just say enable password and then the password, you'll see it in plain text in the config file, which is, a no-no. Now, this password can be seen in the config file, the console password and the VTY. There is a way to change that, but by default, leaving all the defaults alone, this password can be seen. It'll just say Cisco. This password will not be seen. So I'll just show you exactly. Well, let me do the console first. Actually, you should go ahead and do it too. Just like I said, the more times you enter these commands, the better. And again, console 0 can be abbreviated to con 0, maybe even shorter. Yeah, C0. Actually, yeah, C0. You have to put a number, even though there's only one console, you have to put a number. Oh, it didn't. Do I have to put a space? Yeah. So you could do C0, C space 0, if you wanted to really abbreviate it. But just remember that the full command is console, line console 0. And then password. Well, you should always put login, even though the keyword login, well, actually, it isn't there. Even if it is, you should always put login. What the keyword login does is it basically tells iOS that if someone tries to connect through the console, then you want them to log in. You want them to enter a password, assuming there's a password specified. If you were to say, if you were not to have the login command, or if you were to do no login to disable, then putting password there would mean nothing, because the iOS would say, well, it doesn't tell me that when there's a console connection that I should require a login, so I'm just going to let them into the console. So the login has to be there in order for the iOS to prompt for a password. And even though, like I said, I believe it's in the file in the config by default, you still want to get in the habit of putting it in there, because what if somebody did no login at some point behind your back? And, so if you're gonna, do it right, then I'll do that in some of your skills quizzes. When you do configure the console, I have pre-configured your packet tracer file with no login, so that if you don't do login, your password is useless. And you won't get, points for having typed in login. So make sure you do log in. And sorry, so now I want to do the enable password. Now, normally that sometimes I'm not even sure if in a, since this is a simulated iOS, I'm not 100% sure that this will work on a real machine. Normally, I thought enable is one of those commands you had to be in global config mode in order for it to work. I would have expected it to give me an error there. But some commands strangely do work even if you're in the wrong mode. But I'll have to double check that on an actual router or switch to see if it lets me do that. I expected it to give me an error because enable secret is a privileged mode command. I mean, a global config mode command. But anyway, it looks like it let me do it. Now, you saw me do a show running config before. And it showed the running configuration. So I always, when I enter a few commands, I do a show running config to make sure that, that I entered them correctly and everything. I mean, since they're on the screen, I know that I did, but if I just entered like 8 or 10 commands, then I would probably do a show running config to make sure that, everything is as I expected and I didn't make any typos.
But after enable secret class, what does that do?
That now has made it so that when you type enable to go from user mode to privilege mode, you're gonna have to enter a password of class. I'll show you in just a second.
When did we enter the password class?
When you go from user mode to privilege mode. Since you're already in privilege mode, it doesn't, it's not gonna just kick you out. But once you go out of privilege mode and try to get back in by typing enable, it's going to prompt you for a password.
Oh, but an enable secret class, that's telling it that's adding the password right then and there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to look at my config file. And it says invalid input detected. So why is that?
Are we on the wrong line C question?
Wrong what?
What did we call?
Wrong mode.
Yeah.
Right. The show command is a user or privileged exec mode command. Show works in both, but only certain runs work in privileged mode. In user mode. So I'm in config mode and it doesn't know the show command. So it's like, I don't know what that is. So normally I'd have to get out of config mode and do my show. And here you can see enable, secret, and then it's scramble, right?
Huh.
So this is the word class, okay? Class but it's encrypted essentially. So that's what we want. We don't want people to see the enable secret password because it gives them God privileges on the device. And then what else do we have? The console. Console, as you can see, is clear text. So we can see that.
So it's encrypted the same, mine encrypted the same way as yours. Shouldn't they be encrypted differently or?
No, the same word will be encrypted exactly the same way. So yeah, can you beat that? Could you copy that and go to certain websites that have a dictionary of hashes? Yes, you could. I mean, that it's not super secure, but it's secure enough for prying eyes.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to show you is this. Let's say I'm in config mode and I want to look at the running config, but I really, I don't want, let's say I'm in interface config mode or something, and I don't want to get all the way out and have to come all the way back into config mode. So the do command allows you to do privileged exec commands from within config mode. So now I can do show run, and it works. So if you are in config mode and you want to do a show command, which is the most common thing you'd want to do to, while you're in config mode or in config mode to see what your running config looks like now, you have to put do in front of it. And that will allow you to run a command that's normally requires privileged exec mode. Okay, so that's just a little shortcut thing. The other thing I wanted to show, well, I'll show you when we get there. Okay, so set a oh yeah, I know. All right, so we set a console password and a privileged exec mode. So if I were to exit from privileged exec mode, I basically go to where I'm reconnecting to the device at the console. So I press enter. Now it's asking me for that password for console mode. So I have to type in Cisco. And when I do enable, enable, E-N-A-B-L-E, it's going to ask me for the privileged mode password of class.
Class could be anything we choose. Enable
Yes,
secret,
it
whatever.
can be, yes, and class would not be a good password in real life, neither would Cisco. But for the purposes of this class, you will use Cisco in class so that we don't have to reset, do password.
Is there a mode
Recovery
if you
mode.
forget the password when you're in here?
What's that?
What if you forget your password in here?
If you forget your password inside of Packet Tracer, then
Is there a way to wipe
if
it
you
all out?
haven't saved the configuration file, you can just restart the device. Reload. Reload will restart the device. And it will start with the default settings unless you've saved them. So we haven't saved anything yet, right? So if I'll show you that. I'll do a reload. And it's actually asking me, it didn't used to do this, at least back a long time ago when I first started configuring devices. I'm saying reload, which is a reboot. And it's telling me, hey, you didn't save the configuration. So it's nice it prompts you, okay? But if I don't want to, I say no. And now it's saying, confirm, which means just enter to proceed with the reload. And so it restarts, it reboots the device, reboots the switch. And you'll see, since I didn't save that config, that I no longer have to enter a password for it. Okay, so let's go back in and redo that. And now, in order to save your config, it's copy running config to startup config. So startup config is what we saw initially when I first got on here and showed you the running config. It was all the default settings. And startup config is stored in flash memory. And so, it doesn't go away between reboots. The running config is stored in RAM. So the running config goes away between reboots unless you save it. And so what happens when the switch boots, it reads the startup config from flash, loads it into RAM as the running config, and then continues booting with whatever settings are in running config. If you don't save your running config, everything you do within config mode goes to running config only, does not go to startup. Gets only saved in running config. And anything you do here is automatically takes place. So you don't have to do a save, or you don't have to do this command to make it, start using those configurations. As soon as you enter them, the router starts or switch starts, using that configuration. So that's all in RAM until, and you have to do this from privileged exec mode or do the do command from config mode. Copy running config to startup config. And it's gonna say destination file name, just to confirm. That is the default file name that you should always use. Just enter on that building configuration. Okay.
Is that the same as if we were to put reload and then it gave us the option to save? Is that what the startup config is?
Yes. If I had said yes when it asked me to save, it would have saved the running config to the startup. Yep. Okay. So now when I reload this guy, it doesn't prompt me like it did before because I just saved the config. And it just asks me, am I sure I want to reload? And so first it's loading the operating system. And then as soon as it loads the operating system, it loads it takes the startup config, copies it from flash to RAM and applies that configuration. Now I've got that password. Okay. So just make sure, realize that your settings, while they take effect immediately, they're not saved between reboots unless you do that copy run and config start. And just like everything else, there's a shortcut for the names. So you can do copy run start. A lot nicer, a lot easier than, there might even be a shorter version, but that's the one that I always use. Copy run. So run is good enough for running config and start is good enough for startup config. So same thing. Okay. So in your, in some of the labs that you do, you'll be required to save the config. And that's the command to save the configuration. In your skills exams, I'll be asking you to save your configuration as well. So when the instructions say save your configuration, is do the copy run start command.
Are you taking off points if we just do reload and hit yes?
As long, I've never actually had anyone do that. The skills exams are self-grading. So they, I can basically, I put check marks beside the commands I want to be graded. And I honestly can't tell you if reload will count in place of doing a copy run start. So do the copy run start. Because normally you don't reload these devices. Like in a production environment, if you had to make some changes to your router configuration or switch configuration, you don't normally reboot it because that disrupts the entire network. For some of these devices, it might be several minutes. In Packet Tracer, they boot much faster than in real life, as you'll see. In real life, it takes a couple of minutes to reboot. So yeah, you don't typically want to reload the device unless you have to because it's acting squirrely and there's no other way to fix the problem. Then you might have to reload. You don't normally do it just from the configuration changes. So I would prefer you do the copy run start, even if that way, doing a reload fools the program into thinking you did copy run start. And I don't know if it does. I might check that out at some point. Okay, so I think we're good for at least some of this basic configuration. The next is doing the lines. So as I said, the lines, the V2I lines, I should say. So the lines are pretty much configured the same way as the console, password Cisco log. No difference, it's just that how you get there. So there are, on switches, there's 16 virtual terminals. Basically you could have 16 people telnet or SSH into your switch. And that's what that 0 space 15 means. It's basically telling iOS, I want to configure all 16 virtual lines the same way, 0 through 15. I could say just 0, and it would only configure one of the lines. The others would be left to their defaults. Or I could just do the first 5 or whatever. Normally, although there may be a reason to configure different lines differently, typically not. I mean, the only way I could think of it is if you wanted to make things even more secure, which this seems a little bit overkill in my opinion, but when you connect to a V2I remotely through Telnet or SSH, you don't have a choice as to which line you get. You get the first one available. So if you wanted to do something, you could do something kind of tricky where you have some crazy long, ridiculous password on virtual lines 0, 1, and 2. And so what you could do is you could basically open up 3 windows on your Linux or Windows machine and start 3 SSH sessions which would take up lines 0, 1, and 2. And then the third one is your line that you have your own password in that you're going to remember, and something simpler than the ones that you configured for 0, 1, and 2. So once you've tied up line 0, 1, and 2, then when you try to get in on that fourth one, then you'll get line 3. And if that's what you configured your password for, that you could get into. So again, that's the only thing I could think of where, to make things a little extra secure, the first 3 lines are basically ridiculously hard passwords. And the fourth one is, something maybe not as hard, still a good password, but not as hard as the others. And that's the one you actually use. And I don't know if anyone actually uses it for that purpose, but usually you configure them all. So line V2I 0 space 15 gets you virtual terminal 0 through 15, all 16 of them. And you do the same commands, password, Cisco. All right, and now we've got those configured in our running config. Now, if I do a show startup config, SH is short for show, you'll see that con 0 is set because I did a copy run start after I did this, but I had not done a copy run start since I configured these lines. And so in the startup, those aren't set until I do my save.
Why did you break BT the virtual?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know why. It probably has something to do with the fact that at least the switches I'm familiar with Cisco, they have 16 virtual terminals, 0 through 15. Routers, on the other hand, only have 5, 0 through 4. So I think just to So, there's probably in the iOS, there's like an if statement. If this is well, for all devices, that's your default configuration. If this is a switch, then we additionally have these VTYs. That's the only thing I can think of is why they broke it up into the two different banks of commands in the running config is something in the background of the iOS programming. Because the routers only do have 0 through 4. It's only the switches that have 0 through 15. Okay, but you can configure them all as in one go with 0 space 15, as you can see. All right, so that's your basic security of a device. There's a few more things to, security related stuff, and that's what the initial configuration is going to be. It's going to be securing your device because that's the first thing you want to do. Before you put it into service, it needs to be secure, or else, people that are, doing probes on your network might say, oh, hey, we got a telnet thing open. Let's see what we can get into. So the next thing to do, since the line and the VTYs and the console passwords were left in plain text, the next thing we want to do is get rid of that because that's not very secure either. So if we look at the config, at the very top, you'll see a command, no service password encryption. So that is the default. I didn't change anything. I didn't do anything. That's the default setting for the switch. What this service password encryption command does is just what it sounds like. If I enable that and in other words, get rid of the no, then all visible passwords will be encrypted instead of hanging out in plain text, like my console and my VTYs. So in global config mode, service password encryption. Now, we show run, and secret was always encrypted, but now you can see the console and the VTYs are now encrypted to it's really more of a hash, but it's good enough. It keeps casual eyes. If you a lot of times we'll save these files onto the network so that if something ever happens to our config or we make changes and we have to revert back to the original, but we'd already saved the running config, we'll save hard copies of these and sometimes even print them out if we have to troubleshoot something. And so you just don't want casual eyes to see those passwords, even the user mode passwords. They can't really get into too much trouble in user mode. They can really just see status stuff, but nonetheless, you don't want anyone poking around in your devices. For example, a hacker can get tons of information from your, this is a switch, from your router. It won't do me any good to show you this unless I can't do it from here. Never mind. I was going to hook up to our layer 3 switch / router over there and show you a few other commands on a device that's got more configuration, but I don't have my terminal emulator on this device here. So anyway, maybe I'll show you that another time. But a hacker, if they were to get into user mode, they may not be able to mess with the configuration or restart your router or switch or anything, but they can do things like show the show IP route, basically displays the routing table. The routing table, depending on which router it is in your network, will contain potentially all the IP networks in your entire network. And that's not something you want a hacker to get a hold of. They may know, some of your subnets if they got, so far in to be able to hook up with one of your routers, but they may not know the entire topology. And being able to display the routing table will give them a whole lot more information on other targets to attack. There's other information they can get. They can get MAC addresses so that they can spoof MAC addresses on switches or routers and, wreak havoc that way as well. So you want to, even though user mode isn't very powerful, they can still see information that would be useful to a hacker. All right, so that's service password encryption. The last, I think, yes, the last security related configuration, and this is non-functional, but it's something that is more of a legal thing, and that's your message of the day. So banner MOTD, banner message of the day, that's what MOTD stands for, is basically when somebody connects to your device, your router, your switch, through the console, through a VTY, that's what they'll see. They'll see that message before they even enter a password, okay? And for legal purposes, you're supposed to put a message on there that says something like only authorized members of such and such company, blah, 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 may attempt to log into this device. And some of them are super long, just to appease the lawyers. But you really do have to have something, because otherwise, if you don't have something, someone say, I don't know what it was. I was just playing around. But if you have a message that says don't play around, then you've got at least your legal butt somewhat covered. So the message of the day has a syntax where you have a starting character, and you can choose any character you want. Hash or pound is typically used. As long as that character will not be part of your message, then you can use it as the start. It's called the start delimiter and end delimiter. So you put a start character that will not show up in the message. Anything you type after that start character will be part of the message. So and then you have to end your message with the same character, okay? So if you don't use a start and end delimiter, then like if I just had a capital D, then if I just said banner MOTD, do not attempt to log in, then this command would be looking for another capital D to actually end the command. If I hit enter and I didn't have that, so I don't have the end character, if I hit enter, it's gonna keep me asking me to keep entering a message. And it's saying end with the character this, simply because I started it with that. So it's basically going to keep asking you to enter stuff until you enter the end delimiter, and then it lets you out. Okay, so yeah, so you'll see some test questions or quiz questions where they show you the banner message of the day, and then they'll have maybe a start character, but then that character will be part of the message. And then there'll be stuff after. And they'll say, what is the message of the day going to look like? And you'll have to realize that it's going to end exactly where the end character showed up. So let me just do that again. If I do this and say, well, let me use this. Okay, what's my message gonna be? Yeah, it's gonna say, please do not attempt to log in, please contact Greg. Even though I've got stuff after this, it's gonna ignore everything after that second @ sign. So just remember that you need to make sure that your character is not in the actual message and that you end it with the character as well. Okay, and the packet tracer auto grader is really picky, or let's say sensitive on this. So you don't want to put a space after your start character. Because if my let's say I create a model of what the configuration should look like in the packet tracer assignment. And if my model does not have a space after the start character, and you do put a space after the start character to start your message, you'll get it marked wrong. Not much I can do about that. It's, you know, it should have done something a little bit more clever, like trimmed any space, you know, spaces between the start character and end characters, but it didn't. So don't put any spaces after your start character or before your end character. Just start character, the message, the end character without any additional spaces, if you want to get full credit. Okay, so I think that's the last security focused item that we do. Yeah. And then the last thing is saving our configuration. So we already went over that. The show commands, you can look at both your startup and your running. Your running is what is currently active though. Your startup is what is the device booted with. Unless you saved your running recently. So copy running config, startup config, or copy run space start. And anyone that's asking, since I just said how picky the grader was, your commands, even if you use shortcut versions of your commands in the config or in the, the copy run start, it will grade it correctly. Okay, because those commands internally get expanded to their full regular commands. So don't worry about using the shortcuts in the skills exercises. It will grade those correctly if you use the shortcuts or not. Either way is okay. All right. So I already showed you the reload command. If you, this is one thing that you'll be doing typically after you configure a device, the physical devices in the labs to prepare the device for the next person is erase startup config. You know, some people forget, but if you do that, then it deletes the startup config or resets it back to its defaults. And the next time it boots, it's ready for the next person to do their lab. If you ever come up to a device that is prompting you for a password or has a host name set, then you know that the person before you didn't do that, and just do it. Just do if it's asking for a password, then try what it should be, Cisco in class. Hopefully that gets you in, and then just erase the config, do erase startup config, and then a reload. And that basically sets everything back to factory defaults and reboots the device. Okay. So erase, start, and reload is what I want you to do at the end of every lab. And if somebody before you forgot, then do it at the beginning of the lab. I think most of the labs even tell you to do it. At least they do in the beginning Okay, some of this stuff, I'm not gonna spend too much time on. This is, PuTTY, using your terminal program to capture output so that you could save it to a file. If there, I can't remember if there's a lab that has you do that. If there is, then they'll walk you through it. So just know that that's useful sometimes, that you save, you know, like you might be troubleshooting a device, so you can do a show, you know, startup configure, show running config, and capture it to, you know, a notepad file or something like that. And different terminal emulation programs have different ways of doing that. So there's no sense in really learning one of them when any other one that you might use could be different. But in any case, like I said, there might be a lab that has you do that. So yeah, so what this does is, you know, if there's no logging, then doing a show run doesn't get saved anywhere. But if you chose all session output, then it'll capture anything that happens in the terminal. And then you basically can paste it into a notepad file. All right, so there's a packet tracer 255 that you'll do all the stuff we just did. Then you'll do configure a second switch as well. Okay, as I said, review this section on your own, because this is stuff that hopefully you know about IP addresses, the basics, you know how to configure an IP address in Windows. This is a Windows dialog box, so I'm not going to go over that stuff. You know, if you have trouble when you're doing the labs, because you will have to configure your computer's IP address, then probably one of your partners, because you'll be often you'll be working with somebody or multiple somebodies. So ask somebody, or ask me, or if Alan is, I think Alan will be helping with lab on Wednesdays. So, you know, we're not trying to say if you don't know it, too bad. We're saying probably most of you know how to do this. If you don't, feel free to ask when you're doing the labs. IPv6 addresses, same, you know, same idea. We do IPv6 down the road, not for a while yet, though. All right, interfaces, ports. There's really not that much here to talk about. It's talking about different media types, and again, CNT140 covered, you know, various media types. I don't think should be anything new here to talk about. Configuring IP addresses. Since we're getting late, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I will, you know, certainly configuring a Windows IP address, I'm not going to go over. But there's a couple of little things in our devices, in our switches and our routers that might be a little confusing. So a switch, if you remember from CNT140, is a layer 2 device. Layer 2 device means what to you? Like, what type of addresses does layer 2 deal with? Layer 2 of the OSI model, data link layer. What type of address? MAC address.
MAC address.
Yes, who said that? You, okay.
Curtis.
MAC addresses, right? Not IP addresses, okay? So switches don't deal with IP. Layer 2 devices don't deal with IP addresses in the packets that they're, in the frames, I should call them, that they're switching from port to port. They don't look at IP addresses. They could care less about IP addresses. They only look at that outer encapsulation, the destination and source MAC address to build their switching table and to figure out what port to send the frame to. However, why are we then, this is a switch, why are we configuring an IP address? Well, if you'll notice, what we're doing is we're configuring the IP address, not on a physical port. Okay, our physical ports have names like Ethernet, fast Ethernet, gig Ethernet, okay? VLAN is a special type of port called a virtual interface. They refer to them as SVI in the slide here. Must be configured on the SVI, switch virtual interface. So we're not turning this switch into a layer 3 device. All we're really doing here is we are setting an IP address on a virtual interface so that we can access this switch for management purposes remotely. Remember, there's those virtual terminals so that we could telnet or SSH into them. Well, telnet and SSH, they're both part of the IP protocol suite. So that should tell you, okay, well, then there must be an IP address associated with the device if I could telnet into it. And there is, and you can only set it on a virtual interface called a VLAN. Now on routers, we're going to configure the physical interfaces because routers are layer 3 devices and they deal with IP addresses. But switches don't. So the only way we can deal with them at a layer 3 is for management purposes. So we set an IP address on a switch only so that we can telnet into it, ping it to make sure it's, alive and well, but that's about it. It doesn't turn it into a layer 3 device. It doesn't suddenly start, routing based on IP addresses. It just has an IP address so that we can manage it remotely. And you set it just like any other device you'll see with routers. You just IP space address, give it an IP address and a subnet mask. And that's it, almost. So what that does is that gives it an IP address. But now if you notice, oops. Okay, so if you notice in the config, it's got the IP address, but then there's this other thing, shutdown. None of the other interfaces have that, by the way, because by default on a switch, the physical interfaces are all up and running and ready to go. But the VLAN, the virtual interface, is by default shut down, meaning that even though it's got an IP address, I couldn't do anything with it because the virtual interface is essentially disabled. So after you set the IP address, you have to then enter the command no shutdown. And now you'll see a little output that says interface VLAN change state to up. Boom. Now it's ready to be managed remotely. So if I took my PC in my packet tracer, gave it an IP address in the same subnet, I would be able to ping the switch. I'd be able to telnet to the switch since I had the VTYs configured and all that stuff. So let's just do that. So in Packet Tracer, the way that you configure your PC is by clicking on it, going to desktop, close the terminal, and go to IP configuration. So it fills in the subnet mask for me, but with the default for the class of address. And that's all I really want to do. And now I can open a command prompt. Oh, wait a minute, that's not going to work. Well, I'll do it and maybe someone can tell me why I get the result that I got. So pinging, sometimes the first one times out, but I think they're all going to time out. So what's wrong with this configuration? That, I set an IP address, I did no shutdown on the switch. I set an IP address on the PC, 192.168.1.2 in the same subnet. Why can't I ping it?
It's not 1.2, it's 1.1.
1.1 is the switch, and that's what I tried to ping.
Is it because you're using the console cable?
Yeah, I'm not connected with a network cable, exactly. So, just because I have a console, a serial connection, doesn't mean that I connected via the network. All right, that's just a dumb 9,600 bits per second connection that has nothing to do with Ethernet and IP. So in order to fix this, I need to actually connect a network cable from my fast Ethernet, which would be my NIC card on my PC, to any one of the Ethernets on the switch that are also of the same media. Those are fiber optic. Those are twisted pair copper, RJ45. Okay, so now you see, presumably that is going to go green. When the simulation's taking its sweet time, sometimes hitting the fast forward speeds things up. Simulation sometimes overdoes the waiting. I mean, there is some waiting when you first connect before you go, completely linked up, but sometimes they overdo it. Now I can, by the way, up arrow works in our simulated command prompt too. Unless I did something else wrong. Okay. So very often you'll see the first ping timeout, and then the rest will work. And now it won't time out anymore. Okay, did anyone have an idea why that first ping times out? And I have to say, Packet Tracer Simulator overdoes it a little bit. There are times in a real situation where that first one might time out. Not very often. Packet Tracer seems to always time out the first ping. Anyone, any idea what they're kind of simulating in that first, with that first packet? Is there any more work that has to be done with the first packet than the rest of the packets?
Is it because the switch is entering the,
Well,
is it because the switch is entering info into the switching table?
it is doing that, but that's not why there would be a delay. But you're right about that. But it wouldn't cause that delay. Who said ARP? ARP. So if you remember, in order to send a frame from one device to another, you need the MAC address of that device, right? All I have is the IP address of the switch. I need the MAC address, otherwise I can't build the data link layer part of the frame. And that's the only thing that the NIC will recognize in order to read the frame in. So I need the MAC address so that before that first packet goes out, before the first ICMP packet goes out, my device has to send an ARP to get the switch's MAC address. The ping then gets sent, then the switch, well, the switch may have got my MAC address from my ARP. I'm not, it probably did. But in any case, there may have been a second ARP involved, but at least one ARP had to occur before the ICMP, the ping message goes out. And so the amount of time, ping is just, as soon as you hit enter, it sets a timer. And if it doesn't hear reply in that amount of time, it gives you the, scroll up, it gives you the timeout message. And, if that ARP, doing that extra step of the ARP takes enough time, then you might get a timeout. Like I said, in real life, not very often. When there's just, connection directly to the device. But the Packet Tracer kind of overdoes some of these delays that occur in networks. So yeah, the ARP was correct. You need to send an ARP out only for the first packet though, because now the PC probably doesn't anymore, but yeah, he has in his ARP cache the MAC address now of the switch. If I wait long enough or delete it, Okay, now there's no ARP entries. Now, if I do that ping again, I'll probably time out on the first one. Of course not. So that's because the simulation probably kept that MAC address behind the scenes somewhere. I don't know. In any case, you know, that when I first did the ping, I didn't have the MAC address. And after I did it, then I did. Okay. So remember that when you're testing your packet tracer configurations, but you've got, especially once your networks get bigger and you've got 2, 3 routers and some switches, you know, you say, okay, I think everything's configured right, and you do a ping and it's not working, don't go into troubleshooting mode right away. Just like go and try it again, at least once, sometimes more than once. Okay, so the other way to send a message without going into the command prompt, hopefully you remember, is by grabbing this simple PDU. And then that's my source address, and that's my destination address. And where's the window that shows me? They've updated this again, and I haven't played with it since they updated. Oh, there we go. Jeez. I guess it doesn't like Zoom mode very much. It didn't help. Why is this not? Why is this all scrunched up here? What the heck? Oh. I don't know. I'll have to play around with this. Why I can't. This looks different than the last version I used. So I'll have to figure out how to get. This is the part of the window I want to see. When you use the PDU, these little envelopes up here, you'll see down here the results. So I'm up here too. And if it didn't work, or even if it did and you want to send it again, you can just double click on this fire button and that resends the packet. Now it's, oh, I had it in simulation mode. So it resends them. So if you just had to build a configuration with a couple routers, switches, whatever, and you try your ping or drag your PDU from the source and destination, and it times out, just double click on the fire button and try it again. I would try at least 3 times before I started troubleshooting my configuration, because sometimes it actually will time out the first couple. And then by the third, it usually just about always works unless it's a huge, huge configuration. All right, so there we go with IP addressing. So on switches, the only thing you're going to configure with an IP address is, in this class, is VLAN 1. You can configure other VLANs, but we're not going to get there in this class. And you got to make sure you do no shutdown. A lot of people forget that. And that's what makes it remotely configurable. So I could also, if I wanted, telnet into the device. Okay, so now I've accessed it remotely through telnet. And, same username and password for privileged mode and everything. Okay, so that is the basic configuration of a switch. That gets it up and running, gets you to gets it somewhat secure, and lets you remotely manage it. Verifying connectivity, you know how to do that. You basically ping for the most part. And then there's a video associated with that. All right, so that's module 2, and I know we have another module to get through in this week. Yeah, probably. I don't think 3 is very long. But I think what we'll have to do, because it's a little bit getting late to try to start module 3. So, and the labs aren't too extensive for modules 2 and 3. So I should be able to get module 3 done on Wednesday and then still have time for doing the labs. If we run out of time for everyone to do the labs on Wednesday, we'll just push some of it into next week is all. That's just the way it's going to be. Getting all this basic stuff down is so important that if you don't, you're lost for the rest of the class. So I do tend to spend a lot of more time than some of the other modules on this device configuration. Because if you don't know how to do that, you miss it, or you're not understanding it, then you're going to be playing catch up quite a bit. So hopefully I spent enough time so that you're ready to do those packet tracer labs. Do those packet tracer labs for modules 2 and 3, even though we haven't covered 3 yet, before Wednesday, if at all possible. At least the module 2 ones. Packet tracer labs, so that you're ready to do the physical ones on Wednesday. All right, any questions on anything else anything we covered? All right, so we'll see you Wednesday then. See you guys in Zoom. Any questions from you guys?
Yeah, when is this video gonna be available? Cause my shit crashed like at a really vital part and I've been lost for half of it.
Oh, okay. It's recording right now. I'm going to stop the recording. I've got a few things to do. If it has finished processing before I leave, I'll post it tonight in the week 2 module. It's right at the top of the week 2 module, just like I did for the first one at the top of the week 1 module.
Okay, thank you.
If it takes an extra long time to process, I may not get to it till tomorrow morning.
Okay, yeah, I'll just have to run through it.
Tomorrow morning at the latest.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I'm gonna tell Kurt Lieber that you said Nick card. And he's gonna lose his mind.
Tell him what?
I'm gonna tell Kurt Lieber that you said Nick card.
Yeah, a little redundant, right? Yeah, it's old, just old habits. You use the acronym and then for some reason, I just don't want to stop with Nick. So, yeah.
Have a good night. Thank you.
It's like ATM machine, exactly. But a lot of people do it. I'm going to the ATM machine.
It's the same within the military. Everybody has a CAC card, and all you have to say is CAC, but everybody says CAC card, even though it's CAC already stands for everything.
Yeah, the C stands for card.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else before I stop the recording and say goodnight?
Later, everybody. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Oh, I accidentally forgot to submit the quiz 1, but I thought was that part of the one with the where we're just doing the startups to get into the modules? 'Cause I thought I already submitted that because it showed up for that, but it
Say that again.
well, it showed that the first quiz that I didn't submit. But was that part of the modules like stuff for like showing that we like signed in and gave you the screenshots for?
And then the
Or was
first,
that something else?
first quiz should be grab right class here. The first quiz is not part of the like.
It was like due on the 15th apparently. I thought I like.
The week one, module one quiz, yeah, to the 15th, right? Supposed to be a screenshot. You're saying it didn't submit?
Well, yeah, because it was like just showing that you like logged into, to show you that we're logged into the stuff, right? Or
Yeah, well, no, that
Medicare
was,
and everything.
that was the, in the start here module.
oh, okay,
So what's your name again?
James.
Don't,
Done?
yeah, it shows that you didn't submit it. It shows
Okay.
0 for some reason. I don't know why there's a number in there, but yeah, it shows you did not submit it.
All right. Well, I'll go back in tonight because I thought I like submitted that.
So the quiz is what's at the end of module one, and then you answer the questions and it shows you your results and you take a screenshot of that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I thought I probably got confused because I was like, well, it was part of the, start here and.
Right. No, module one quiz is at the
Spaced
end
out.
of week one.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so I'll just submit that then.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
But-
Yeah, I'm gonna be pretty lenient on late stuff this first couple weeks while people are figuring things out, so.
Yeah, I got a little sidetracked. Everybody around me has been getting COVID, people in class, mom, dad, girlfriend, her daughter, everybody's getting it. I'm like, please, I don't want to get it. I had it once and I had it with long COVID. It sucked ass. So,
Mm,
but, all right, well, thank you.
all right.